Yes, good afternoon and good morning to everyone who is listening or watching us. We're back from a short break. This is the conference on the Beyond Rebuilding Europe after Napoleon, and we are back with panel 4. We had a wonderful panel this morning or this early afternoon with Lien Verpoest and Christos Aliplantis, and we're now continuing in listening to ways and means of transforming Europe, in particular in early 19th century Germany, in the German Confederation. We're listening, we will hear more about the police, about fortresses, but we will also move to North America in that same period. I'm very happy to introduce to you the 3 panelists of this afternoon. We had a 4th one, but she already went to fill in the spot for another colleague who fell ill. So we now have 3 panelists, means that we have ample time for discussion. My name is Beatrice de Graaf. Together with Alex Mikaberidze, I'm hosting this conference. I'm from Utrecht University and specialized also in early 19th century history and a little bit in current time history as well. I would like to start now with the first presentation. That presentation will be given to us by Dr. Zev Segal. He is an historian and a digital humanist from the Open University of Israel. He has a wonderful website which is called Space, Maps and Movement in History. Really like that. And on that website you can find more about Zev. He's interested in mobility, space, and communication. He wrote a book called The Political Fragmentation of Germany, published in 2019, and Motion in Maps, Maps and Motion, published in 2020 by Amsterdam University Press. And today he will talk to us about the foreigner and the drifter, the Gendarmerie, and the attempt to limit movement in 19th century Germany. Zach, you have the floor. Sorry, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just open my microphone. So thank you very much, and good Saturday to everyone, whatever time it is. Thank you for the conference organizers. I'll go right into my talk. 19th century German society and political thinkers were conflicted between the traditional decentralized Holy Roman Empire and the centralized France, moving towards localized autonomies or a greater unity. The separate German states, independent since the disintegration of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, and the local autonomous communities coined by Mac Walker as the German hometowns, took mostly opposing sides in this matter, while the former strove to integrate the newly formed independent states, Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, Württemberg, and Baden, for example. These are the 5 states that I dealt with, through centralized administrations and reforms. The latter wished to remain independent with regards to their communal, legal, and economic routines. But how does this introduction relate to the German police? The police was exactly at the forefront of the power struggle between the state and the community. On the one hand, the police was perceived since the 18th century as a major instrument of control and was thus seen as the basis of state power. Accordingly, internal security was separated from external security and the police was differentiated from the army. On the other hand, police activities were too invasive to the community for the community to accept without protest. The police was a communal issue and was not seen as state domain. State involvement in local police was perceived as a threat to social order. Localities were accustomed to legal and judicial autonomy and were not about to surrender these rights. As a result, even state-oriented thinkers such as Johann Justi suggested that the police should be managed by the local communities and not by the state. In contrast to other 19th century centralized German reforms in education, communication, transportation, economy, religion, and law, the police remained the major victory of decentralization supporters. In fact, the first German State Department for police activities was only established in 1936. Even in a militaristic state such as Prussia, police was minimal. In the first half of the 19th century, for example, only 204 police officers were responsible for the 400,000 people of Berlin. Bavaria, as an example of the smaller states, which will be the main focus of my talk, gave the Munich municipality police autonomy in 1796, which was gradually given to all the towns housing more than 2,000 families. All other small and medium-sized states followed suit, but the need to delineate police jurisdictions limited these autonomies to urban councils rather than small country villages. In general, the medium-sized states did not succeed, nor did they attempt to gain full monopoly over their armed forces. Law and order was the responsibility of the community and not the state, in contrast to other centralized European states such as Britain and France. This does not mean that police was not a part of the contemporary German daily life, but rather that it was not a part of the state apparatus. However, the state did develop its own internal security doctrine regarding those that moved in the shadows and cracks of the regular police. What we would call a securitization of the movers and doers, the drifters and the foreigners, led to the formation of the German state polices. The police operated in the gray areas between the jurisdictions of the local police forces. But this type of police force required completely new enforcement, since it dealt with the supervision and control of moving elements. The first component of this control was the passport. Passports were first mentioned in 1548, but until the 19th century, they were single-use character reference, providing defense for noblemen as they came upon foreign places. Following the French Revolution, every foreigner in France had to carry an identification card, which was no longer a simple insurance, but rather a detailed manifest of the physical appearance of the cardholder and a documentation of his or her travels. German states soon followed and implemented a much stricter passport policy. Regulations required registration at a local police station at every place in which a person stayed for longer than 24 hours. Violators of the passport regulations could receive severe penalties ranging from deportation to life in prison for a serial violator. The contrast between the relative indifference of the German state to local policing and its harsh and even oppressive passport policy reflects the internal security doctrine. The threat to internal security would not come from foreign armies or local criminal activities, but from drifters that broke the communal collectives. While industrialization and enlightenment were leading towards greater mobility, German authorities were trying to limit and reduce movement. In order to supervise the passport regiment, a state police was established, the Gendarmerie. Brent Wirsing claims that this was the first attempt of the state to take control of internal armed forces. Historian and criminologist Clive Amesley claimed that it was meant to demonstrate state presence in the countryside and fortify its exclusive role as a law enforcer. Unlike the static police in the towns, the gendarmeries were established in order to patrol the roads and guard postal deliveries and tax collectors. Initial attempts to construct such forces failed, since they relied on the traditional police structure. First success appeared in the 1810s, once semi-military horse-ridden units were established, inspired by the French Gendarmerie, in Saxony 1809, Bavaria 1812, Hanover 1815, Württemberg 1823, and Baden 1831. These units were called by different names and were organized slightly different in each state, but their objectives and modus operandi were identical. They differed from regular police units since they were all state-controlled and relied on horse-ridden forces which patrolled the country roads. Their official role was to inspect the documents of any traveler on the road, but the hidden agenda can be understood in the directives of Friedrich von Beust, the Badenese gendarmerie inspector. To protect the border against the entry of such people that threaten and bother public security, the subjects and the economy alike, and be placed at the many border crossings from neighboring countries. The border was seen as a crossing of dubious people who might harm society. Similar fear from people in the geographic outskirts is reflected in Bavarian protocols. The 1827 instructions for Gendarmerie border watchmen states that they must use local intelligence and patrol since people will try to deceive and defraud them. The gendarme should never forget that he has to deal with sly people who seek to deceive in every way. The directives were clear. Any person caught wandering without permission will be regarded as guilty until proven innocent. Consequently, any local or foreign peddler along the border was seen as an immediate suspect. Saxony is a good example of ideal gendarmerie forces. These operated on a basis of small local headquarters that did not require a complicated hierarchical structure. The Saxon Statistical Yearbook details 18 centers in 1819 compared to between 4 and 8 in all other German states. During the early years, most of the forces were situated at the center around the capital city of Dresden or the west, close to Leipzig. A gradual expansion led to a growing homogeneity of gendarmerie distribution. The second map shows that units were later homogeneously dispersed across the whole state territory. However, Saxony was the exception. Despite the aspiration to create a strong force that will control movement, the number of movers were too great and the number of policemen was too small. Bavaria, for example, intended to form a force of 1,700 people, but the 1819 budget enabled the recruitment of 1,500. All other medium-sized states recruited merely several hundreds. Although the forces gradually grew, they remained rather negligible, especially when compared to the amount of traffic. While the number of people on the roads cannot be accurately assessed, the number of issued passports can indicate the amounts. Between 1830 and 1833, 188,000 transit permits were provided annually in Munich alone for journeymen. At the same time, 18,000 journeymen passed through Dresden every year. The number of movers was so great that the efficiency of patrolling police forces was questionable at best. The construction of railways from the mid-1830s made the supervision of movement, borders, and passports almost impossible in the given system. By the 1850s, millions of train passengers crossed district and state borders on a daily basis. Hundreds of gendarmerie policemen and the German passport regiment were helpless. The 1848 revolution led to greater cooperation in the areas of political intelligence and deportation, but did not affect the distribution of the gendarmerie. The actual distribution reflects, more than anything, distrust in the ability to enforce the official rules and regulation. Of all the German state borders, the only one guarded with fences, watchtowers, and patrols was the Prussian-Russian border. In all the other states, borders were abandoned and the supervision was shifted to the centers of large cities and the regional train station. The number of places in which a routine inspection of passports was held was very limited, although regulations required that a passport had to be examined as a person crossed the border. Although the gendarmerie were meant to patrol the country roads, they quickly became another urban force. The central evidence is the fact that the state yearbooks in Baden-Württemberg, Hanover, and Bavaria detailed only the headquarters in the large cities, without any mention of their spatial dispersal. Consequently, we can assume that the majority of forces were located in the proximity of these headquarters in the district capitals and not along state borders or in the countryside. In Bavaria, for example, the transfer of the gendarmerie to the capital cities, and especially to the capital city of Munich, occurred in parallel to the establishment of a Bavarian customs unit in 1828 that took sole responsibility for border control and annulled the necessity of a portable police force. This unit began as a Gendarmerie department, but was transferred in 1837 to the customs authorities as an economic enforcement agency. Consequently, the Gendarmerie soon became an additional urban force guarding state and urban institutions rather than the countryside. The spatial deployment was not just skewed towards district capitals, but rather skewed towards the state capitals. An examination of the number of units and policemen in each state district shows that the distribution was far from uniform. In Bavaria, for example, each district received in 1820 2 gendarmerie units, except for the capital city district, which received 3. By 1824, Munich police was cancelled and replaced by a gendarmerie company, which led to civil tension in the city. Replacing the civil police force with a semi-military state force was a clear indication that the purpose of this mobile forces was no longer their original goal, but rather guarding the royal capital. In Hanover, gendarmerie, police, and prisons were deployed across the state, but most of the forces were located in the southeast, next to the capital city. In 1860, the southeast housed 6 out of 9 police headquarters, 4 out of 8 prisons, and 3 out of 7 gendarmerie headquarters. Although the centralizing tendency was stronger than in Bavaria, the direction was similar. A similar process can be perceived in Württemberg and in Baden. The number of forces reflects the focus on the capital city and its surroundings over the control of the border and the countryside. It must be mentioned all along that regulations never changed. The aim was to control the countryside. To conclude, the gap between the real distribution and operation of the state police, the gendarmerie, and its official goals reflect a gap between declarations and actions. The official goals show that state construction in the German state was dependent on the identification of people with their localities. As a result, local autonomies were maintained with regard to policing, despite an otherwise centralized policy. The state implemented a securitization of movement, which led to an association of any type of mobility with immoral and illegal actions. However, this was never implemented and never affected the actual movement of people. Although the original distribution of forces was evenly spread out across the territory to fit the pronounced policy, it was immediately skewed towards the district capitals. The futility of their declared agenda and their location in the district capitals gradually transformed them into another state apparatus structured to guard the government institutions. As a result, they were concentrated in the capital city in all the states, except perhaps for Saxony. Medium-sized German states were very careful with regards to the operation of enforcement units in the general public. These forces, whether army or state police, kept a lower profile. Security was to be achieved by not using force, rather than by manifesting state power. The responsibility of law enforcement was transferred to local authorities, and the role of state forces was limited to being symbols. Although Prussian militarism and Austrian oppressive policing are usually portrayed as the German story of state forces, the smaller states depicted here were totally different and rarely acted in such a manner. These states understood the limits of power and acted accordingly. John Stanton Ife, in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, claims with regards to state power that there are limits to what the law can achieve because some of its tools are blunt, some tools do not work, others are counterproductive, some exasperate the problem they were supposed to resolve. Although the German states might have wanted to control mobility, technological innovations such as the train, economic constraints, and cultural circumstances made any such attempt futile. The law was never altered, but the actions professed an acknowledgement of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Segal. I will take over while Beatrice is engaged otherwise. We'll follow the program, and our next speaker is Professor Frank Rojo. And I'll let him right here. Frank has studied political science and history in Jena and obtained master's degree in European culture, cultural history in Frankfurt on Oder. His PhD thesis deals with the topic of military architecture and state building in Habsburg Empire in the middle of the 19th century. His research interests turn around the question of how power relations were reified in space and time. He's particularly interested in Central European history of the 19th century, imperial history, history of administration, and interdisciplinary approaches towards historical questions. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much also for this very kind introduction. Although I have to correct that I'm not a professor yet, one day, I hope, but there's still some way to go. So I will try to share my screen. Let me check here this. Okay. So I hope it's working. Yeah, you can see my slides. Okay, perfect. So yeah, first of all, thank you very much, dear organizers, for this opportunity to share some of the first results of my research about the Federal Fortress in Rastatt and the functioning of the military commission of the German Confederation. Today, I would like to illustrate how a micro-level analysis can significantly contribute to our understanding of the German Confederation as a collective security system and of German politics in the pre-March era in general. Let me start with a quotation. So, why should the rich Germany fear some millions which are spent for its real security? Is it not better to build now when everything is flourishing than dreaming of a perpetual peace and then receiving the disadvantages of a disappointed feeling of security? These two questions, which seem to stem just from these weeks commenting on the shift in the German military policy after Russia invaded Ukraine, were in fact asked already in 1846. The unknown author has developed his ideas about fortified central places, Zentralpunkte, in 3 articles and came to the conclusion that fortifications were by far no waste of money, but a measure for security that pays off. With this article series, the author commented on the newly created fortifications around Paris and Lyon, just as the projects in the German lands. The threat that was perceived by the Germans at this time was clearly posed by France. In order to create a counterbalance to any potential French revisionism, the statesmen at the Congress of Vienna had decided to create the German Confederation. The Confederation constituted a cornerstone of the European security system after Napoleon, as you all know, a role that it could only take on because it was, I quote, able to defend, but structurally unable to attack, as Heinrich August Winkler has put it. Although this political organization existed for around half a century and played an important role as a political arena and actor in the pre-March era during the revolution and in the formative phase of the German Empire of 1871, historical research has so far failed to reach a nuanced view on it. Often, it is still portrayed as an instrument for repressive and anti-liberal politics and the stage on which the play of the Prussian-Austrian dualism was performed. However, from a more legal and administrative point of view, the main objective of the Confederation was the securing of the independence and invulnerability of the single German states. One of the instruments the German Confederation was given to reach this goal were the so-called federal fortresses. Those in Luxembourg, Landau, and Mainz were already created from the 1820s onwards. At least one more was planned right from the beginning. Ultimately, 2 more fortresses were erected in Ulm and Rastatt from 1842 onwards. In the following, I will concentrate on the events around the Rastatt fortress. With this focus, I will be able to reveal how the military commission, a sub-organ of the Federal Confederation, functioned and what mechanisms of negotiation and communication existed within this organization. This is especially interesting because military affairs are so closely connected to questions of security and ultimately sovereignty that disputes over them must be regarded as intimately touching the self-understanding of the member states. This organigram shows the position of the military commission within the institutional structure of the German Confederation. The 2 overall constituents of this general structure are the several member states and the Assembly of the Confederation, also called Bundesversammlung or Bundestag. This assembly consisted of envoys sent by the states with concrete directives. Communication of every kind between the assembly and the military commission had to be conducted through the Committee for Military Affairs, equipped with members of the assembly. Further, it was solely responsible to the assembly too, since it was conceived as expert body that had to deal with purely technical aspects of military affairs, strictly bound to the instructions of the assembly. It did not obtain any decision-taking competence or. A closer look at the military commission reveals the internal substructure. It consisted of 6 members with voting rights. 1 voice was given each to Austria, Prussia, and Bavaria, and to each of the 8th, 9th, and 10th Army Corps. Austria presided the commission. Since the mentioned corps contained military divisions from different member states, the command and with it the representation in the military commission followed a certain rotation scheme. Every March, the new envoys were welcomed. Often, the previous ones remained in the commission without voting rights. In general, the atmosphere was quite cooperative. This was the case for the working together between the representatives of the different divisions of the Army Corps, as well as between the members in general. There was no sense of rivalry between Austria and Prussia, for example, on a work-related level. The Austrian presiding member represented the Prussian envoy in times of absence, just as the Bavarian and the Prussian helped out when the Austrian was unavailable. This cooperative approach is further tangible when we look at the organization of the work. When an issue was directed to the commission by the committee, 1 member was appointed who would prepare a presentation. This referat, sometimes better understood as report or review, would sum up the topic and propose further steps to take. Upon this proposal, a voting took place. Every of the 6 regular members had the same vote. Decisions were taken by majority, but the minority could submit a statement together with the majority's one to the committee. The commission's field of activity was described by the founding document of 1819. It was responsible for the supervising of the state, of the federal troops, was heading all kinds of fortification works, exercised the command over the federal fortresses, and had to take on any kind of task given by the assembly. Since it proved inefficient to discuss especially everything connected to the fortresses in the big round, in 1833, the responsibilities were distributed among the members in such a way that 2 members were responsible for 1 fortress. This distribution was of course outdated the moment the creation of 2 more fortresses was decided. As mentioned, the idea to fortify an additional place was already brought up in 1818. Local commissions were formed whose task was to examine the places and to draw first drafts of the envisioned building projects. Differing opinions, however, about the concrete realization and what place would be more important and thus receive the majority of the available funds resulted in a deadlock. In 1824, the local commissions were finally dissolved and the drafts were put ad acta. In 1840, the discussion received a new impulse. In the atmosphere of growing hostilities between France and the German states since the 1830s already, the question whether the southwestern German flank should be finally fortified was again put on the agenda of the assembly. Already in 1937, it gave this subject to the Commission, which reported back to the Assembly more than 3 years later that Rastatt alone would not be sufficient to protect the main operation base of the federal forces. The Prussian members summarized that only Ulm and Rastatt together formed the defense system that could meet the requirements of the Confederation. However, since the given task was to identify one place as main operation base, all members agreed that this could only be Ulm. Still, until the Commission reached beyond its prescribed field of activity, it recommended the creation of 2 fortified places, Ulm and Rastatt. This recommendation was given back to the Assembly. It seems like the entire discussion was right where it was already in 1824, but the circumstances had changed. The perceived threat from the West had reached such a level that the unprotected flank was regarded as real danger. Thus, the Assembly reached the decision to fortify both places in March 1841. Reinhard Wagner, already at the end of the 19th century, has already identified this as breakthrough and a shift in the strategical assessment of Rastatt, fostered by Prussia. His Prussian-friendly narrative does not quite comply with the facts, however. Therefore, I would like to argue here that at this point it was rather easy, especially for Austria, to agree on these formulations because it did not touch Ulm's role as primary operation base, as it was supported by Austria. What shape Rastatt would take place was completely open at this point. Under the impression of the political circumstances, the Assembly voted for the fortification of both places and gave instructions to the Commission to recheck the drafts from the 1820s. The Commission distributed the task to review the drafts in such a way that the Prussian representative Radojewski was responsible for Rastatt. The instructions further stipulated that the new drafts should not only include the revision of the older ones, but should be elaborated under constant consultation between the Commission and the respective state in which the fortresses were to be built. For Rastatt, this meant that the Great Dukedom of Baden was involved. This middle-sized state was represented through the Lieutenant Colonel of the 2nd Division of the 8th Army, Georg Heinrich Krieg von Hochfelden. Krieg played a vital role in the coming negotiations around the drafts for the building project. For the moment being, he served as nexus between the Commission and the War Ministry of Baden. He regularly informed the War Minister about the informal decisions dealing with the topic and occasionally received instructions. Meanwhile, the Great Duke of Baden Leopold launched a request to Austria whether it could deploy some military engineers to Rastatt in order to draft new plans. The motives behind this request remain unclear at this point of my research, but the lack of adequately trained militaries in Baden and the high reputation of the Austrian military engineers were definitely of relevance. Mid-May 1841, nobody less than General Director of the Austrian military engineer troops, Theodor Count of Bayer-Latour, former president of the Military Commission himself, and later Austrian War Minister, arrived in Rastatt. And he did not come alone, of course. Together with him came Georg Eberle and Julius Wurm, both not only high-ranking members of the Austrian staff of military engineers, but also former members of the local commissions of around 1820s. Together, they developed a new project, which was ready to be presented to the Commission by the end of July the same year. Yet, Krieg did not forward the drafts to the Commission, but held a confidential meeting with Radojewski. And later also Radowitz. They consulted about how to proceed from here on. And they reached the conclusion that it would be more productive to have confidential negotiations between Radowitz and Krieg before the first one presents his review to the Commission. According to Krieg's reports to the War Ministry in Karlsruhe, the aim of these meetings was to bring their ideas to, I quote, absolute concordance, quote end. Only then would a common proposal be submitted to the Commission for further consultation. Radowitz and Krieg met several times. Krieg sent detailed reports of these confidential meetings to the War Ministry. In the beginning, he indeed seemed to be very optimistic that the ideas could be brought together. However, soon he recognized that the differences could not be bridged. Before we look on how the negotiations continued, I would like to have a closer look at Krieg. It was always said that the envoys sent by the member states to the different bodies of the Confederation were mere executors of their government's instructions. The correspondence between Krieg and his war ministry, however, shows that this was by far not the case. No doubt, what Krieg uttered and did as envoy to the Commission was definitely backed by the ministry and ultimately by the Great Duke. Yet this does not mean that the course taken was simply stipulated by the ministry. On the one hand, the ministry depended on the information that Krieg forwarded and could only reach decisions on the basis of this. Krieg's assessments as part of these reports naturally could not overcome a certain degree of subjectivity. On the other hand, Krieg's letters also contained outspoken recommendations, which the ministry often, although not always, followed. In this respect, the final course that would be followed by Baden and the Commission must be regarded as a result of a communication process between at least two parties, here Krieg and the War Ministry. At the same time, it must also be admitted that there was no sign of outright opposition from either side. This leads me to the assumption that the discussion whether or how the envoys were brought in line to the politics by the respective government is to some extent redundant, because these representatives were so intimately connected to the instructing institutions that it was simply unnecessary to keep the rein on them too tight. Krieg serves as a very good example in this respect. He was not only the envoy of the 3rd Division of the 8th Army Corps at the Military Commission of the German Confederation. At the same time, he continued to be an infantry lieutenant colonel of the Army of Baden and adjutant and close confidant of the Great Duke Leopold. Furthermore, he wrote books on military history just as on local history. Together with the fact that he engaged in many local and regional historical associations, indicates to what extent he identified with the region. Therefore, 3 main fields of identification can be attributed to Krieg. Firstly, the army, of course. Secondly, non-military networks. And his belonging to a regional elite. Thirdly, thus contributing to the military protection of the region of Baden was surely one of his main objectives, not only in professional terms. Let us return to the structural level. The negotiations between Krieg and Radowitz had reached a deadlock. This, however, counted only for the content, not for the further procedure. Both agreed that the military commission should not deal with all the details of the drafts as Krieg and Radowitz had done. Instead, only the general layout of the fortification should be debated and voted upon at this moment, so that the discussion would not get lost in questions for details. This common tactic proved to be very successful. After Radowitz's presentation in March 1842, the Commission voted for the general layout of the Rastatt Fortress already 3 months later. All further discussions would only be dealt with after the Fortification Directorate had submitted their annual plans for the upcoming building phase. This touches a highly sensitive issue, the relationship between the Military Commission and the local commissions, respectively the Fortification Building Directorate. In the 1820s, the subordination of the local commissions under the Military Commission was undisputed. Now, the state of Baden insisted on its sovereignty and its right to command the troops at the construction site. It deducted this right from the decision taken by the Federal Assembly concerning the creation of the fortification. This said that the planning and realization of the projects had to be undertaken under constant consultation with the states on whose territory the fortifications were to be built. Further, it was stipulated that the Military Commission had merely the right to inspect and to receive reports. The War Ministry in Baden added the argument that everything that happened in connection to the construction would be done so according to the laws of the Great Dukedom. In reverse, that meant that the same polity was legally liable for any violation of these laws or any accident. The final reglement, as submitted from the Military Commission to the Assembly, surprisingly ignored these concerns. However, this is only a superficial impression. The legal framework was more complicated than this one document displays. Here it must suffice to highlight that the orders which the War Ministry issued to the Fortification Building Director clearly proves that he was primarily serving the Great Dukedom of Baden and not the Confederation. Private letters from the director further show that the legal subordination under the Military Commission was rather a formal structure. Real decisions were taken elsewhere, mostly at the Directorate. This leads me to the last institution I would like to have a look at. The Fortification Building Directorate. In Rastatt, this directorate was headed by Georg Eberle, a lieutenant colonel of the Austrian Military Engineers Corps. Former Austrian engineers assisted him. Additionally, 9 officers, none of them engineer, from the army of the state of Baden completed the directorate. If we look at the professional trajectories of Georg Eberle and Julius Wurm as the most prominent figure of the group of 4, we see that the cooperation in Rastatt was not the first time they worked together. They had done so already within the first local commission in Rastatt and again some years later in Prague and Mainz. Finding them again here was probably no coincidence. But their way split only in 1848, when both were forced to leave Rastatt. Eberle went first to Frankfurt and later to Lemberg, where he was vested with the position of a genie inspector responsible for the fortification works in the Galician capital and Krakow. Already in 1855, he died. Wurm also returned to the Habsburg monarchy, but used the impulses he had gained in the German lands to write a continuation of a standard textbook for Austrian military engineers from the 1820s. Traces of his German time can be found at many places in the book, such as a repeated reference to the gates in Rastatt. Their appearance hint at the discussions about architectural styles as they were being held in the German lands. Particularly Karlsruhe was where the building director Heinrich Hübsch was well known as a place where new ideas were developed and propagated. Not at least through model drafts, Wurm transmitted some of them to a specific audience in the Habsburg lands. This touches the meaning of the Rastatt fortress. For Wurm, the southwest German lands were a node of architectural discourse. For Eberle, for sure, constructing the fortification in Rastatt was the most significant task of his professional life, as this picture illustrates. You see the Rastatt fortification there as a plan lying over the table. If we look at the city of Rastatt and its population, the creation of the military structures meant hitherto unknown degrees of interference into their lives and regulations of behavior. On the other hand, it boosted the economical development of the area and the improving of the urban infrastructure. On a broader scale, the Rastatt fortress symbolized the unity of the German states. The newspapers of the 1840s celebrated the fortification at the southwest flank of the Confederation as great achievement on the way to unified Germany. And here we can locate the case of Rastatt in the regular course of the development of the European states. The conviction that the states should be defended at the borders and not at their centers, meaning that every portion of the country's territory constituted an essential part of the state and should be protected against any outer aggression, was one of the military repercussions of the development of modern statehood. What surprises is the appearance of these border fortifications at a time when it was well known by militaries from all European countries that they were inefficient and basically outdated. That they were nevertheless constructed was especially a phenomenon in those countries that underwent a belated political nation-building process, such as Germany and even later the Habsburg monarchy. In this respect, the Rastatt fortress served as cornerstone of a symbolic policy which expressed the equality of the different states of the Confederation. This was particularly tangible in the Prussian contribution to the report by the Commission from October 1840. Radowitz referred to the general nature of the German Confederation by emphasizing that it is neither, I quote, an indivisible whole nor a plurality of single states, quote end. Thus, the Confederation could neither obey the general interest nor the particular one. In strategic respects, this meant that one could not retreat from certain provinces and leave them to the enemy to concentrate forces in the hinterland for a counterattack. A last aspect at which I can only hint here is the boundedness of fortification to territory, or one could even say soil. Building a fortress in Rastatt meant rendering its territory sacred in a fight against a more powerful enemy from the perspective of Baden. In Rastatt, not only the integrity of the great dukedom of Baden would be defended, but the basic idea of the entire confederation. And yeah, thank you for your attention. And as kind of a conclusion also, I would like to show this picture, which shows the room where the military commission convened usually. And yeah, I think this also symbolizes the equality of the different states. Well, I did not really elaborate on the conclusion because I think that it's not yet at the end. I'm not yet at the end with my work, so I'm also open for suggestions and remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so very much, Frank Rojo, for this wonderful talk about fortifications and their functioning. And this leads us on to the last presenter on this panel. I would have liked to introduce you, Frank, but somehow my camera and my mic didn't go on, so I was there all the time. I was listening to you. I'm very happy to introduce to you now properly Christopher Radojewski. He is a program advisor responsible for environmental diplomacy with the Powering Past Co-Alliance Secretariat. He worked in federal provincial relations and US relations for the government of Alberta. He holds an MA in political studies, and he specialized in international relations and in diplomatic history. He published in 2017 the Rush-Bagot Agreement, Canada-US Relations in Transition. He's now based in London, and he will tell us more about post-Napoleonic security in British North America. So thank you very much that you're here, Chris, and you have the floor now.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to my fellow panelists for their very interesting conversations as well. My colleague Frank has set up the stage very well. We'll also be continuing the conversation on forts, but I will be taking a page in a little bit of comparison with Dr. de Graaf here, whose analysis of European security I'll be looking to apply into North America. So I know we are talking about rebuilding Europe after Napoleon, but there's still a thought about how do we rebuild North America after Napoleon. So I'll jump right into this and look forward to some of the questions that will come. Ultimately, the Napoleonic insecurity reaches North America, and the War of 1812 is an extension of European conflict. The US, as a relatively new power, a growing one at that, not a great power by any means, will move to conflict with Great Britain as a result of infringes on their sovereignty. The first impressment, which was the impressment of American citizens on ships that were stopped by the British Navy, searching for British deserters to refill the needs of able-bodied seamen to maintain British naval superiority in the naval engagements against the French. But additionally, sanctions by both the French Empire under Napoleon as well as the British infringed on American sovereignty. And for a country that took a foreign policy approach of staying out of Europe, the wise words of Washington as he gave final remarks leaving his presidency to stay out of European engagements, ultimately that went as so far because the US in their early years were quite willing to move to conflict with the European powers as it related to defending their sovereignty, whether that was through the engagement with the Barbary pirates off the coast of North Africa, the quasi-war with France, and then ultimately the War of 1812. And the irony is, and then when we're talking about setting the stage of this insecurity, is that American foreign policy in this period is quite a reflection of British foreign policy in pre-1815 period. British foreign policy was very much using its geographical separation to engage when needed, to protect their own sovereignty, to keep the balance of power in play, but ultimately would remove to themselves and look to sort of operate in their own sphere of influence. And likewise, the Americans do take a similar approach, which makes a lot of sense considering they had just thrown off the tyranny of British rule in North America. I think one of the other interesting things that I've sought to explore with my research is sort of where the balance of power elements apply in the North American context. And of course, there's a lot of concepts of colonialism, imperialism touched on a little bit as well by Giuseppe and Kieran yesterday as they spoke about fortifications and spoke about sort of the influence of colonial powers in this period. I think one of the most interesting ones, because it doesn't necessarily come up much in the literature as it relates to European security, is the future of an indigenous state in North America. So for those Canadians that are on the call here, we're quite conscious of indigenous politics and indigenous sovereignty, the legacy of that today. Ultimately, War 1812 vis-a-vis the negotiations at the Treaty of Ghent between the British and the Americans removed the future of an indigenous state, which the British had put on the table, which changes the balance of the nature of where indigenous nations play in the European continent. And it very much makes it more European-esque to a certain degree, as a sovereign to sovereign relationship very much disappears from this period onward, and that legacy is still seen today. Additionally, one of the interesting things is, as much as you do have concepts of collective security, and what I'd like to pull into this period is this concept of mutually assured destruction, which some of you have probably heard in the nuclear element and has come up in with the recent invasion of Ukraine, but ultimately it was a result of economic interests as it related between the United States and Great Britain. Both of them needed each other extremely. The US was thriving for British manufactured goods for a growing population. Britain needed new markets. So in the post-war of 1812 period, both of them ultimately quite tense period, as I'll get into in a second, but neither want to go to war. The economic drivers of this relationship are more important ultimately. So while both countries will ultimately prepare for war with troops, fortifications, and take many of the actions used in the European security paradigm and applied in the North American context, as I'll jump into specifically, ultimately the economic nature was that withholding force, kind of the ideas of free trade that we use today that would, ideally prevent conflict. The evidence of a security dilemma in North America is quite clear, as I'll explain a little bit further as well, around fortress building and the use of troops and naval forces. Ultimately, despite both Great Britain and the United States looking to take defensive postures to increase their security, these defensive postures ultimately fuel insecurity by the increasing levels of troops or naval forces or fortification buildings. And one response on one side, very much as you read sort of the diplomatic relations here and the complaints raised by both countries, you see the insecurity that's being instilled as the British increase their naval forces off the coast, or fortress building in the United States prompts that as well in British North America or Upper and Lower Canada at the time. And ultimately, this defensive pretext is ultimately about deterrence. Both countries are looking to maintain what they have, maintain the status quo, and deter the other one from involving in their own affairs, which relates to that sort of approach of foreign policy. Picking up where my colleague on the panel left off on forts as a tool of security, I found it very interesting in his opening remarks that he mentioned that the German Confederation was taking a very proactive approach to their security. That was not the case in North America. And I think that very much goes into that idea of imperialism, sort of the metropole versus the periphery. The sort of situation for the British in North America is secondhand. Everything will come after the security concerns in Europe, which is a much closer and a much bigger threat to Britain. But as the great power in the world coming out of 1815, why the use of forts are great, and I think Professor de Graaf has sort of laid that out in the case of Europe, is forts are inherently defensive. And where I've sort of picked up on that is in an era where the Britain are not looking to, looking for a period of security ultimately after 15 years or so of conflict or plus, it's the status quo. And because fortifications are so fixed, it's not like troops where they can be moved, you know, they can be easily defeated or forced out. Fortifications, once built, are set. And so if we're talking about maintaining a status quo, maintaining certain balance of power, dynamics, and deterrence, fortifications are a great way of maintaining that. In the context of North America, fortifications are not new. Anybody who's been to North America, most of the big cities you will know today were actually laid out by military engineers and are on the most military strategic places. I invite you to Quebec, to Montreal, to Kingston, to Pittsburgh, all of those places, early forts. In the context of using forts, though, in the post-1815 period in both Europe and North America, what I find really interesting is even the Duke of Wellington will note that forts ultimately are technologically obsolete. And Napoleon really showed fortifications or fixed fortifications. Yes, they can be used as outposts and for supply trains and very much useful in the North American context where you still have relatively lightly populated areas. New fortifications can maintain the routes. There are not a lot of roads like in Europe to avoid certain fortifications as Napoleon does on the continent. But ultimately, they are running out of style. New artillery, new tactics make forts really interesting as a choice of security. And I think in that vein, that inherent defensiveness, that maintenance of the status quo is pretty important. In the post-1812 period, post-1815, the US actually are first to move on the fortification building because the priorities for the British are, of course, in Europe. What's really interesting, though, is it's Wellington himself that will bring the paradigm of security, both in fortifications and troops, as I'll get into, to the North American continent. And although Wellington will actually never visit North America, when he's made master of the Board of Ordnance in 1819, he will be responsible for the defense of North America. And following certain boundary disputes and also the Rush-Bagot Agreement, which I've written on as Professor de Graaf mentioned before, but I'll speak about it in terms of troops, the choice of those diplomatic approaches make forts an inherent approach and a really important approach since the countries have decided to proceed in this manner. And so Wellington, the force that he is ultimately in the politics of the British, despite the economic concerns, despite the concerns for economy by the Treasury, is going to push forward a number of measures. However, even Wellington himself isn't going to be able to maintain this. His proposals are being brought back in terms of spending, but it's ultimately very interesting where the motivation, and this goes to my comments about my colleagues' panel, where it's not a proactive approach to fortification necessarily in North America, it is driven by crisis. And the crises in 1823 and 1825 between the French and the Spanish, with potential French designs on Spanish colonies in North America, are what going to motivate the British even more. And in 1825, there will be a new commission to review the defenses of Canada. And it's that commission that will ultimately shape what is still left when you tour Canada today of the major fortifications, the citadels, the pieces that still exist today, ultimately come from this 1825 report. It's in these times of crises that these pieces are mobilized. However, improved relations very quickly bring back the spending. So all of the reports and proposals for security and fortification building in North America will never come to their full potential because the economy concerns we'll draw these back. In terms of the security dilemma, I kind of spoke about it in my introduction, but the fortification building on both sides will prompt the other to take a similar approach. The US responds in the 1820s to the security crisis as well, vis-a-vis not just the French and the Spanish, but the British, with $8 million for defenses. Interesting of note, where they will spend most of their money will not be on the frontier with Canada. Some of it will be spent there, but most of it will be on coastal defense. However, they're plagued by the same challenges as the British, which is where ultimately economy concerns get in the way. And by the time these forts are practically finished, it will be the crises of the Oregon dispute in the 1840s with the British, and in a second, that will get these fortifications finally finished. And so ultimately, it's a 20-year period for the US to complete their designs on their fortifications. I think the best way to sum up the approach as it relates to fortress building in North America is the illusion of the Martello Towers. And as you can see on this slide is one of those 6 Martello Towers built at Kingston, Ontario, where I did my master's. These were the most technologically advanced Martello Towers in the world. If Kieran's on the line, I'm sorry, Kieran, I'm sure the Irish ones were great. But the interesting thing is this is built in response to crises again in the 1840s. However, once the crisis sort of subsides and economy concerns get into place, these towers will not be fortified until 1863, 20 years later. So for me, I think it's a really good example of the priorities of the imperial government as it related to the peripheries in terms of security concerns. They were valid and they were very focused in times of crises and tension when there was the risk of conflict. But ultimately, as that disappeared, you have this situation. Then one of my last slides here is the use of troops. And so as de Graaf also lays out heavily, the occupying force is very much important in Europe. And after the War of 1812 subsides in the end of 1814, with the reprisal of Napoleon in 1815, tons of regiments are rushed back for ultimately the conflict, which will become the Waterloo campaign. Many will just be reaching the shores of France as the Battle of Waterloo takes place. And so most will not get there in time. But again, the priority is not on the continent. There is an interesting approach to demilitarization, and that's actually led by the United States. Ultimately, the Great Lakes, which are on the shores of Toronto, if you've ever been to Ontario, were very much seen from a defensive purpose as the way to control the campaign, to launch successful invasions, as was seen during the War of 1812. Ultimately, the US and the British will agree to demilitarize the Great Lakes for economy purposes, and by 1817, those forces will be limited. However, in the long run, this is very good for the border relationship between what will be eventually Canada and the United States. But by the 1840s, conflicts, again, I say sort of demilitarization because both governments will contravene the terms of the treaty through the 1840s and the 1850s and eventually the Civil War. Wellington, again, is this champion of security paradigms from Europe and North America, and he has a perfect number of 13,500 for regular troops in Canada's and the maritime provinces alone, not including the West Indies. And that is a purely defensive force. And I think it maintains not only, some people will call Wellington a defensive general. I'm sure I'll raise some eyebrows there. I don't mean to do that. But I think it also plays into the broader politics and approach of the British Empire, which was defensive. And so 13,500 troops meant 2 field armies of 5,000 that could be used to defend an American invasion, with the rest allocated to the garrisons of fortresses along the border. This was not an invasion force, and in Wellington's opinion, could not be used as an invasion force. So troops were used as a deterrent, and in times of crises and tensions, the British will respond. In 1837, Wellington's perfect number is nowhere close to being reached. Troops have dropped to 5,000 across all of British North America. So very much undergassed. But as both Upper and Lower Canada rebel in 1837 and 1838, the British take this very seriously. because it's also an internal risk here. And by 1840, there are 11,500 troops in the Canadas alone, just Upper and Lower Canada, or what would be Quebec and Ontario today. And, you know, in a more sense of this, and many of you may not know about the rebellions, and that can be explored in the questions maybe for the sake of time, but ultimately, you could say this is a pacifying force, but the tensions with the US and the US role in the rebellions ultimately raise a crisis to a different level. And so I would have a hard time believing that it's just a pacifying force when the naval forces in the Atlantic for the British across 1838 alone go from 27 in January to 36 ships in June to 41 by the end of November that are stationed off the coast of the United States and Canada. And I think maybe just to sort of finish on this slide, the remarks by the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada at the time really kind of put this deterrence in perspective. Quote, "The American government must be anxious to avoid war with us." But a year later, he also remarked that war was pretty much imminent and unavoidable. So as much as I mentioned at the start, that these countries were not looking to go to war with each other, they certainly were preparing for that. Finally, there's just three myths I want to address, which are the context of the defense of the undefended border. Canada and the United States will claim to have the longest undefended border for the last 200 years. As I've pointed out, even in this 50 years after Napoleon, that is definitely not the case. It was a very heavily militarized border throughout the 19th century, and that perspective very much changes not until the 20th century. The militia myth, very much a myth. Although Canadians had rallied at times in arms for the defense of Canada, ultimately this is an imperial military endeavor by the British, and it's them that are going to provide the security of North America, and they have a hard time getting the provincial governments to put up troops for the defense of Canada locally. And finally, 200 years of peace since the War of 1812. Well, there was many cross-border conflicts. While there was no open war or open hostility, ultimately another myth that needs to be broken. So just to recap in terms of conclusions, economy was the focus until times of crisis in terms of defense and security in North America. Deterrence was very much important, and it was not just deterrence in relation to the US. Both Britain and the US policy were very much aligned. Neither of them wanted European foreign powers in North America. And Brexit jokes aside, Britain was forgotten. They were a European foreign power, but the United States did not. But neither of them wanted France or Spain or any others like the Russians participating in the North American theater. And that relates to those similar security paradigms that come across from Europe, very much evident. And then there is a bit of balance of power and the maintenance of the status quo that, as you see in Europe and across the colonies, as Kieran and Giuseppe sort of referenced yesterday, related to Ireland and the Mediterranean, you also see in North America. So with that, I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Chris, for this. I really loved your talk, and thank you so much for the generous remarks to my work on the Wellington Barrier as well. And I also see now a set of questions emerging from the audience and also from myself, although I'm chair and I should lay back a little bit, but it's of course very good to see how the military, the Gendarmerie, the police and the fortresses in peacetime, how it tied together in thinking about security and what security actually was. So I'm starting with the first questions to Frank and Zev, and then I also have a couple of questions for you, Chris. Zev first, and perhaps Frank could follow suit. The interesting thing is, Zev, about the Gendarmerie. It was, as you said, an instrument geared towards state building. Yet if you look closer into the way the Gendarmerie was set up, it was also very much put on the ground to prevent people from smuggling, to prevent organized crime. For example, in the woods, you mentioned the land and the urban spaces, but if you be reminded of the Spessarträuber, for example, the thieves and the robbers in the woods who smuggled across all those lands to France and to other countries. So how do you see that function then for the Gendarmerie, if it's not just about state building, but also for getting a hand on the taxes, for example, and prevent people from evading the taxes? And a question for Frank, also a little bit tied to that. If you look closer at the armies that also manned the fortresses, as Chris also was talking about, were those armies, and this is also a question by Christoph Ali Prantis, were those armies then not more oriented towards facing the population, controlling the population, and preventing riots, revolts, and unrest, rather than looking outward to defend the Confederation along the borders, as you said, Frank? So wasn't it not also much more geared towards controlling and oppressing the population? And was there also a link with the creation of the Zentrale Untersuchungskommission and the many police organizations and agencies of the German Confederation? So I'll first give Zev the floor, and then Frank, and then over to the questions for Chris.
Okay,
Zev, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll go back to the structure of my talk. I started with the fact that the German states were actually very centralized in most of their reforms. They tried to centralize their economy and their law, and pretty much every field of government was very beginning to be very centralized, except for policing. That was a very fundamental part of what we consider today as part of the government, which was decentralized. But then they found this crack, this area that is not controlled, and it actually fit the ideology of centralization by a central government and the needs of the communities, because it strengthened the communities if the state police would govern the outskirts. So it actually fit both ideologies. So at the beginning, it wasn't part of a state building component. It was actually actual control, need to control smuggling, take taxes from places that aren't controlled by communities. But the catch was that they weren't very good at it for various reasons. Partly because of economy, or because of logistics, or because eventually they simply didn't have enough forces to actually control all this countryside. And that's where you find the agenda stays the same. They're still controlling, as if the regulation still aims at facing smuggling and controlling the borders and controlling the outskirts. But the forces started moving, shifting towards the headquarters, shifting towards the centers of the towns, which actually meant that no one was guarding, no one was actually trying to catch these smugglers. And that's where you find the discrepancies between what they were aiming for, what they actually did. And that's when the Gendarmerie, like the army in lots of these states, became much more of a symbol than actual force. They weren't supposed to actually control the outskirts. They were supposed to be seen here or there.
Yes, thank you very much, Zev. If you are ever in Germany again, you should visit Lohr am Main. There's this museum of the Spessarträuber, where you see how the Gendarmerie tortured the thieves and how the thieves got away with it. So it's also a fertile ground for all kinds of Märchen, how do you say, fairy tales that were based on the Spessarträuber. Frank, would you like to follow suit with a response to the questions that I just raised?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. Starting with the first one. So if the fortifications and the troops stationed there were also not directed towards the population, well, I can clearly say that in the cases of Rastatt and also Ulm, this was not the case. There were other places, I know from, especially from the Habsburg Empire, after 1848, where the fortifications were planned and also erected specifically at those places where uprisings played a role. Yeah, so they were conceived as instruments to secure the integrity of the state as such. Yeah, here this was not the case, as I said, but this of course does not mean that there were no repercussions of this troops stationing the troops there. I mean, especially Rastatt, you saw the map. Yeah, it was not a so big city, and of course, stationing some troops there, maybe several hundreds, played an important role also. And especially during the constructions, there were several thousands of people just coming there, helping there, constructing this fortress. And of course, this meant also a challenge for policing these masses, if you want so. And in this respect, of course, it had repercussions, but they were not intended with stationing the troops there. And of course, what I think is important to say here, that in peacetime, 100% of the troops were actually soldiers from Baden. So there were no foreign troops. Yeah, only in war times, then I don't remember the key exactly. Either was 1/3 troops from Baden and 2/3 from Austria, or reverse. So only in wartime, this really could have significant influence there. And about connections to other institutions of the Confederation, I do not have any evidence so far for that. So, but of course, I will keep my eyes open.
Yes, thank you, Frank. And for Chris now, Chris, the forts were used for defense. It's sort of similar question that I put to Frank and Zev, but you could also see them as a method for controlling populations. And in North America, there may also have been a push to build forts to pacify the own population, the indigenous population. Do you know anything about that, about the fortresses and the way they turned, let's say, backwards towards their own populations?
That's a very good question. I think starting off with the indigenous portion, most of the fortresses that were built, at least by the British, in regards to sort of the indigenous populations, were very much used as trading posts. So they weren't very defensible to a certain degree. They were very much used as outposts. A really good example, I think, is what's still sort of left of Fort Niagara, which is on the US side of the board, and during the War of 1812 is a US fort that was attacked by the British. But ultimately, the way it was designed by the French in the first place was in regards to, it was heavily fortified and could be defended very well by the water, but it didn't want to look too imposing because it didn't want to look like a threat to those indigenous populations. You have very much a different relationship, at least with the French and the British and the indigenous populations very early on. I think definitely as fortification building takes place, in the United States, maybe less evidence in the Canadian side of things related to the indigenous population, but you do see them more towards defending frontier settlements and the like. In terms of democratic movements in Canada, the 1837 and the 1838 rebellions, they were very small rebellions. They didn't have a lot of support. They were over in a mere matter of weeks in some cases. But the British took it seriously. Over 20,000 militia were actually raised. The one time that the militias actually do show up from the provincial governments, they're able to raise 20,000. And I think the troops get up to about 13,000, almost reaching Wellington's perfect number per se, as a response. But it's very much, I think, and I think the Navy reaction sort of shows this, that it's not purely about pacifying the population. I don't think they saw it extremely as a risk. What happens there is American support. And during the 38 rebellion in Upper Canada, there is a Royal Navy party that goes across to burn an American steamer that was supporting the rebellion with supplies and troops and ferrying them across the border. And that's ultimately what sparks diplomatic incident when sovereignty is broken. And so with those tensions and the crises that erupt in the years that follow, the forces then become more of a deterrent mechanism. So in terms of Canada, you don't see the troops being used as much as a way of enforcing sort of the population. But I should note that by the 1840s and then into the 1848, Britain is responding to these democratic movements with legislation and changes to the legislatures of Canada, and what we call responsible government will make its way to Upper Canada by 1848.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of more questions for you, and then perhaps also another question to Zev and Frank. A little question, Ruud Kaspari calls it, to Chris. Chris, did the French small islands off the Canadian coast, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, did they have any role in the fortification plans for Canada? Do you know about it?
That's a very good question. I think that's something that I need to dig into further. I think the it's a little bit different because Newfoundland is seen a little bit different as a separate colony. It's not included in the maritime provinces to the same degree. But I think the response mainly to those islands was from a naval perspective because they are two very small islands. There was no necessary fortification building. But in terms of being able to supply these ships, there's major fortification building to Halifax, and not just in terms of a fort per se in the citadel. My closing slide actually had the Halifax citadel, but ultimately as building up the naval docks and the ability to operate a navy in the North Atlantic. And St. John's, Newfoundland, which is sort of the most far east point of Canada, will ultimately take similar measures, but not to the same degree as Halifax.
Thank you. And another question on another country, coming from Alex Mikaberidze. Can you comment, Chris, on the role of Spain in the post-Napoleonic security system in North America? Did Spain feature at all?
Spain caused a lot of problems, particularly in the relations between Britain and the United States. The Texas question, the role of Mexico, the role of Florida, all of these are key pieces in this situation. I find it very interesting that actually it was French designs potentially on Spanish colonies in the early 1820s that really motivates the British in the early 1820s to respond. But what's interesting is around the crisis of Texas and Mexico and then South America, and I mean, Professor de Graaf, you'll know more about this than I in terms of the continental security responses to South America. It's interesting because Britain is very overextended by the 1830s. And even in the context of the rebellions of Canada, I find it really interesting that they were able to commit so many troops because there's ultimately 3 wars going on at the same time as the Texas crisis, which is the first Afghan war from 1839 to 1842, the second Egyptian crisis, same start date until 1841, and then the Opium War from 1839 to 42 as well. So for the Palmerston governments, you know, they want to be engaged. And I think there's always a desire in terms of the Spanish question and how these are causing instability in the relationship. I think the greatest thing that I'll note is the Monroe Doctrine, which I think that could be a whole lecture unto itself. But just to quickly comment is it very much aligns the British and foreign policy. And the Monroe Doctrine, interesting enough, comes out of a reaction to the British looking to ally with the US. And the US, because of this foreign policy approach, don't want to do so, and so issue a unilateral declaration, which is very much laughed at by the European powers to the degree it has teeth, to the degree that it means what we interpret it today. There's a lot of questions on that, but I think that's really interesting, and it kind of is a really good example of how Spain and the decline of the Spanish Empire causes most of this instability in the Western Hemisphere.
Yes, I think you're right there, Chris. And indeed, in the 20s, up until the late 20s, there's still very much discussion going on amongst the European powers whether they have to intervene or not. But then after the Monroe Doctrine, of course, that becomes far more difficult. And at one point, the United States also considers whether it could be part of the European Congress system, but Congress system doesn't want the US in their midst. It's a very fascinating period. Another question to Zev and to Frank. I don't know which of you would like to comment. That's a question on the cooperation and on the relation between other countries surrounding the German Confederation. If you have the Gendarmerie, or if you also take the fortresses into account, they were facing France, the fortresses, that is, not the Gendarmerie. And there was also talk of working together in combating France, in pressing revolution, in identifying revolutionary threats. And within the Quadruple Alliance, but also within European intelligence networks, there was also talk of cooperating together. And for example, you mentioned drifters and movers, Seth. I know that in Belgium and in the Netherlands, Belgium from the 1830s onwards, of course, this was also considered a threat. And they worked also together with the ministries of the justice system. So can you comment on those international relations, either in cooperation or in conflict, for example, with France? Don't know who.
Oh, yeah.
Seth, would you like to go first?
Yeah. So in terms of cooperation regarding the Gendarmerie and the drifters and the borders, at first, at least from what I know, there was very little cooperation. And actually the deportations were the most interesting cases, because how these deportations were handled were pretty much throwing them across the border at some point. So there were lots of stories of also diplomatic issues, because these people were thrown away at some point to a different country, to a different location. Some of them actually died. So there were lots of issues around this. And as I mentioned, after 1848, there were two things that changed in terms of policing. The one was an international cooperation in terms of political intelligence. It's connected to the talk in the previous panel about spies and about all this issue of intelligence. So after 1848, because this fear of radicals was so stressing, an international police force or some form of networking of these intelligence forces were being dealt, but also in terms of deportation. Deportation was now being regulated to specific times, to specific negotiations between states. It wasn't just a matter of collecting these people and throwing them across the border. There was actually treaties and protocols of how to conduct these deportations. But except for that, in terms of the actual policing in the states, that, at least from what I know, there wasn't any cooperation. And actually what you see at some point, part of the Zollverein, the effect of the Zollverein was the fact that lots of it was reduced. Also, I didn't mention it in the talk, but lots of the need for control of smuggling, for example, was reduced once there was no border customs, or at least there were much fewer border customs gradually along this time period.
Yes, thank you. That's very fascinating. I think Karl Herter also wrote about these extraditions and the treaties that regulated them. Frank, could you contribute to this as well?
Yes, I think I can. Maybe not too much, but I would highlight that the Netherlands and Denmark were also part of the German Confederation, right? So, and maybe if you remember on one of my slides where I put the names of the delegates, there was also a delegate from the Netherlands and one also from Denmark represented in the commission. In that particular year, they did not have voting rights, but since there was this rotation scheme, it was just a matter of time, I think 1 or 2 years, until they would have a voting right again. So, and they supported the whole course of those negotiations. And so here you see that there was quite a fruitful cooperation, I would say, at least no opposition that was that I could get from the sources. Also, I would say that, of course, the fortress in Luxembourg would be much more interesting in this respect here, of course. But since I did not get too much into that topic, I cannot contribute too much. I think there are really better experts here. But I would also like to mention that in some newspaper articles, there were quite interesting comments on an overall defense strategy for the entire German Confederation, not only towards the west, but also towards the east. So the fortification of Posen, yeah, for example, was thought together with the fortification in the West, so that the German Confederation would be able to defend itself to any side, so to say. And here, I mean, the North and the South were not really perceived as threats at that point, but at least East and West.
That's very interesting. I had a question for Chris as well. And yes, have 1 minute. There's a question from Ivan Ordones exactly on this. Despite the Holy Alliance, Ivan asks, was Prussia and the German Confederation developing defense strategies towards Russia? Do you know about that, Frank? Yeah. And Zef, would you like to add to that as well?
Yeah, just adding in general to this concept of foreign and local. I just want to mention that when I examined the locations, because my thought is very spatial, so when I examined the location of army forces as well as police, you can actually see that the emphasis wasn't on what we consider today foreign borders. In Baden, the emphasis wasn't on the French border. In Bavaria, it wasn't the borders of the south or the borders to the north. Each state had its own internal issues, and these forces were mainly focused on internal issues. And you can actually see when you look at the location, the geography of military and police dispersal, you can actually see how in each state it changed based on who they conceived the internal problem at that point, or whether they actually wanted to deal with that internal problem. Because lots of times, for example, Bavaria and the Pfalz, which was a huge problem in terms of opposition, they sent very little actually forces to that area in order to somehow limit their appearance there, in order to lower the tension. So it's interesting to think also of that it wasn't just a matter of, well, we have a problem with foreign forces, but also sometimes these forces were meant to deal with internal issues, and sometimes they were meant to hide in case of tension, but that no one will actually feel them.
That's still, I think, quite a modern rioting police instrument not to show up. Frank, could you say something on Russia?
Yeah, I think I can. Also, just building on what Zef said. I think, for example, erecting the fortress or building the fortification structures in Poznan, the move towards that came mainly from internal reasons, right? So the idea was to secure the territory for Prussia against any kind of Polish, thoughts of becoming independent again or whatever. So, and here, of course, this was a great opportunity for the Prussian state because they could develop fortification structures there, build it as one of this mentioned central places, so a central operation bases, and by this fortifying the border to Russia without actually fortifying the border. Yeah, so you had great army troops. You could easily concentrate the troops there and equip them and whatever, even keep them there permanently without that anybody could say that you are preparing something against Russia. Yeah, and this was a great opportunity in this respect from a strategical point of view, I would say. But yeah, on the other hand, also that in fact there was really a very neat control of the Prussian-Russian border. I mean, I think it also had other reasons. For example, this whole issues of diseases, and quarantine discussions and so on.
Yeah, fascinating. Back to North America now with another question to you, Chris. Also a very interesting question from Eric de Lange. What about the International Congress, Chris, as part of the post-Napoleonic security structure? How did North Americans view this novel form of diplomacy? Aix-la-Chapelle in 1818 was seen as a potential threat. European anti-piracy efforts in Latin America, for instance. Paris in 1856 was also seen by Americans as not completely positive for them, abolition of privateering, for example. Was that the general US attitude towards multilateral negotiations, or did they still want to take a role themselves? So how did they view this international congress system that you spoke about?
Very interesting question. To be quite honest, it's something that I'd love to dig into even further. But maybe I'll start off with your comment from before, where there is interest from Secretary of State and then later President Quincy Adams in terms of participating in the Congress system. But ultimately, funny enough, he's also the same gentleman that will write the Monroe Doctrine, which is very interesting when you think about it. I think in terms of it, yes, I think very much, and McDougall, if I can remember his name. Yeah, Walter McDougall, who did the Pulitzer Prize on called Promised Land, Crusader State. It's very interesting because he breaks ultimately U.S. foreign policy into an Old Testament and a New Testament. And that Old Testament, which is kind of prior to the First World War, is very much based in those early days, building on each other with that sort of concept of liberty and free from external interference and the ability to dictate its own actions. I think the problem for the US was twofold. One, it is a fairly weak state. If it came into the Congress system, it would be a second power. One of the interesting things is the fact that it is a confederation, and that the states in the US have, even today we talk about states' rights, that limited the power of the executive. Andrew Jackson, who does come about in this period, will start some of these centralizing efforts, but ultimately they're very preliminary. And so to the degree for the US executive to flex its muscle, it's quite limited in terms of even decisions of foreign policy. And it very much exists within Congress, where it's a lot more centralized decision-making with the European foreign powers. I think the second element goes to the Monroe Doctrine itself, where while the document is written, the ability for them to execute on these elements and sort of push back, I think, verbally they will write, and there's a lot of diplomatic transactions with the British, and I'm sure with other foreign powers at the same time. The US were very active in the diplomacy sphere in terms of flexing their muscle, but they didn't have the military power to back it up. They also didn't, and I think the key thing coming back to this multilateral approach is they never wanted to be the second partner. They were always worried. There was worries about the French. There was worry about the British. The initial rebuff about the British vis-a-vis the French in the 1820s is they don't want to be second fiddle to the British. And I think that is ultimately the main driving force for why there is interest in that multilateralism sphere, but ultimately the US stay out.
Yes, well, I always thought that, well, I wrote about this, Quincy Adams, he wrote the Monroe Doctrine. I always had a feeling that he did it out of spite and frustration over not having been let in. So you mentioned before that it was a reaction on the British wanting to do trade or arrange things in South America and do this with the US. But I also had the feeling that it was a kind of a reaction on being pushed out or not even let in into the Congress system, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so to a degree. No, I think that's very spot on. I think the other element, which is interesting, which is addressed by Bourne, who writes very heavily in the 1960s on sort of the military troops and ship movement at the time, he attributes it to the fact that British proposals in this sort of quasi-alliance in response to the French and the British is a decision, or sorry, it's a clause per se, that neither the US nor the British would expand on the continent. And it's that point, I think, is the other kicker. So I agree with your point. And I think the other kicker is that point that was put forward by the British to limit American expansionism. The British were very much looking in the case of Cuba at the time, but the recent sort of growth of the US, the US was not interested in agreeing to something that would limit potential growth, and with multiple views on their destiny per se to go from sea to sea.
Yes, thank you. So if there's no more other questions in the chat, and I'm looking at the panel, do one of you Chris, Frank, want to comment on anything or ask a last question? No? Then I think yeah?
Oh, I was just going to say, very interesting. Sorry, just to the point that Zeph and Frank made around non-fortification borders. I think there's a very interesting thing in the North American context. It's good to bring it always together, right?
Yes, thank you for doing so.
No worries. A lot of the population, even today, for the Canadian border is along the US border. And so the fortification building that takes place is along the frontier, but at the same time, because of economy reasons, in the same way of Poznan and in West Germany as well, ultimately the approach is about defending the population. And so much of the fortifications and the supply depots are arranged around the towns and arranged around the population. It's not about defending the frontier as well. So I thought that was just a very similarity where clearly in kind of the Netherlands respect in terms of fortification building, it is very much a frontier sort of fortification setting. It's still based around populations for sure, but for economy reasons, I mean, with the 180 mile border just within the upper and lower Canada alone, you just couldn't defend that.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, Zeph, please.
If I can also say something connecting in my perspective, I thought it was very interesting to hear on the one hand, there was Frank and Chris talking about this international defense, and I was talking about the internal defense, but all of us were talking about this connection between what states wanted to do, what states were able to do, and also in some ways, and also that came up with the questions, what the impression was of what they were doing, how people actually thought of what they were doing when this fortification or these fortifications were being built up, or when the patrols were starting to move around the countryside, or when they came into the city. So there's always this issue with controlling and with forces, that you have this interplay between aims, agenda, the ability to do it, and eventually the appearance.
Yes, very happy that you bring it up, Zeph. I do think indeed that in this transformative period after 1815, that's the period that's on the agenda and at this conference, that the role of fortresses is still very, very under-researched. And indeed, were fortresses erected to defend the population, but we have not yet arrived in the age that there is seamless border control. It wasn't possible at all. And before that, I mean, the 18th century, the whole Napoleonic War era is still the troops that they march throughout the country and they look for each other or try to evade each other and find battle at the theater of war on the battlefield. But the Waterloo battle was the last big battle of that kind in that way. So it's also from a military perspective, the role of fortresses, as Wellington, one of you commented on that, I think you did, Chris. Wellington already knew that fortresses are really obsolete. Still, for the defense system, they are there, but are they there to politically glue the Congress together, glue the Quadruple Alliance together? Are they there for just Gendarmerie or the armies to garrison them in order to control the population? So it's all a kind of blurred, and the functions are still a bit, mixed up together. So I think it's, and your panel really brought it up together with Kieran McDonnell, who spoke yesterday on how the armies that were deployed in the barracks also got into fights with the local population, for example, which I also really, really liked as a paper. So I think we could continue this talk, but we won't. So thank you for joining in and responding to each other and to each other's works. It really makes it a unified whole, this panel. So thank you, Chris and Zeph and Frank, for being with us this afternoon, or this morning for you. And a warm thanks to all of you. We cannot join into the applause, but I'm making that warm applause on behalf of all of us. And we will now have a long break because there are many people based on the continent who perhaps need to cook dinner. I have to do that for my children. And then we have to reconvene, or we are going to reconvene at 7 p.m. Central European time for the last panel and the last concluding keynote lecture. So thank you very much on behalf of Alexander Mikaberidze and everyone else who organized this conference, and hope to see you somewhere else soon. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.